It's camera avarice. I'm living in a hipster paradise. Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy with my tricked out, very cringy Nikon ZF. Nice classic Nikon strap. All kinds of pins because I'm a teenage girl. And here riding on top of my camera is the Sigma 45mm F2.8 DG DN contemporary lens that kicked off the whole I series of essentially experience lenses from Sigma. Here, this lens is metal. It's beautiful to use. It's got a great feel. Got manual aperture ring here. Although if you prefer to control it from the camera, you can put it into this A setting and do so. Nice knurled metal focus ring, really smooth, nicely dampened. I love it. We do have an AF MF switch here and a metal hood, which is great. Now, this is one of those lenses that Sigma has made for the experience of photography. So this is not necessarily going to be a good astrophotography lens. It is a good experience lens, and I love it. But as with all things, if I own a lens, I'm going to test it for astrophotography, so we can kind of see how it does. F2.8 isn't F4, so it might have some utility. Here, there is a plastic hood here, and this covers up the 55mm filter thread, but definitely not the 55mm element. The front element on this lens is pretty teeny, so that's leading me to believe we're going to get some vignetting and that type of thing. But for a normal field of view, who knows if it's going to be good or bad. The only way that we can tell is by testing it. So let's do that now. Let's get into Lightroom and see how this lens performs. Howdy folks, welcome to Lightroom, wherein I review yet another lens that I bought because I'm a big hipster and I thought it looked good on one of my cameras. The Sigma 45mm f2.8 DG DN contemporary lens. The lens that was the, I suppose, inspiration for Sigma's, and I say this with air quotes, I series of lenses. I don't remember what the I stands for, and they don't actually put it on any of the boxes or materials or in the lens name, but apparently that's it. Anyway, this lens is probably not a great astrophotography lens, but it's fun and it looks sick. So there we go. Anyway, I'm probably too old to be using that word in that way. Probably. I cringed a little bit. I'm probably too old to be using cringe also, but I'm gonna anyway. Okay, let's get back on track. So here I have a bunch of samples, some taken with the A7R Mark V from Sony, some taken with the Alpha 1 from Sony. The A7R Mark V shots here are going to be 60-second track shots with the aperture stepping down. Here, 15-second shots on the 50-megapixel Sony Alpha 1 on a tripod. And as you might notice from some of my reviews, I made a mistake. I made a mistake using my camera here because I used the Alpha 1 for wildlife photography and I left it in Super 35 mode, which makes a 21 megapixel crop sensor sized image. So it's not 45 megapixels anymore. It's equivalent focal length of 67 millimeters. That being said, we'll still look at least the first one here because it'll give you an idea of star trailing and that type of stuff. But I keep making that goof. Luckily, here at 45 millimeters, this is almost too long to really just use on a tripod anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Along with all of my modality here, my methodology, the track samples are tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II portable star tracker. Fervent Astronomy just so happens to be the North American distributor for said brand and product. So if you're interested in learning more about the LighTrack II, head on over to ferventastronomy.com where you can learn more. When you're there, you can also find a link to these samples. There's a link in the description. It'll bring you there. These samples will be available for your personal use to assess the performance of this lens. That being said, please respect my copyright. Please don't distribute or redistribute these images online or elsewhere. Please don't misrepresent them as your own, and please don't use them for the basis of your own review, etc. Just use them in good faith for the purpose for which I am supplying them, which is to assess the lens. And if you want, take a peek at how the cameras do here at their various settings. While you're also at the website there, you might want to read the article explaining ISO invariance, because that will help you understand why I am shooting at ISO 320 on the A7R Mark V and ISO 500 on the A1. Essentially, just to really boil it down, these cameras both each only have 2 real ISO values, which is to say 2 analog amplification stages. Everything else is just digitally amplified, the same thing that happens when you bump the exposure here in post. The thing is, higher ISOs are going to be locked into the file. So if you, let's say, blow out a star or a galaxy core or something like that at ISO 6400, you can't bring that back. There's no way to get that highlight information back. If you, for the same exposure time at the same aperture, take that same image at ISO 320, you might retain some of those highlights, and you might be able to bring some detail back out of the highlights, while at the same time maintaining the same noise performance, maintaining the same detail in the shadows, what have you. Same, everything else the same, just maybe a little bit better. So that's why I shoot at, in the case of these cameras, their second base ISOs. Now that we got all that stuff out of the way, let's look at some samples here. We're just going to start with the F2.8 sample with alpha 1. I'm just going to boost the exposure a couple of stops because it's very dark. And we're going to pop in here, and already this is an APS-C size, so we're just going to zoom out a little bit. You can imagine if this was the full frame version, this is roughly the field of view we'd be seeing. We're just missing all this. And from this kind of viewing distance, I can't see the star trailing. I can see the star trailing when we're zoomed in here to fit. And if we come in here and just crank it to 400, well, the star trailing is really apparent here. It is a fairly high resolution sensor after all. So if you are using an A7 III or an A7S, something like that, you might have slightly less star trailing. That being said, there's a little bit of fringing, maybe a little loss of contrast here, a little spherical distortion, but we'll save that for the tracked samples. And yeah, just star trails. This is probably pushing the type of focal length that you'd want to do untracked shots with. Now, these are the track shots. They're very dark. We will boost the exposure. All right, let's go take a look here. 45 millimeters f2.8. So right off the bat, we can see on the navigator, there is some vignetting. I do like to look at the navigator for these types of things. It makes it a little easier to see. There, you can also see that there is a bright patch in the center here. And if we stop down to 3.2, that bright patch does go away. This might indicate a little bit of loss of contrast wide open, although it is providing a little bit more exposure. Overall, it's maybe not adding too much, and it's not bringing in a lot of exposure to the edges. So yeah, but now our 2.8 lens is 3.2. It's pretty dark, all things considered. And keep in mind, we're boosting the exposure already on a 60-second tracked photo. So I might just live with it and shoot wide open. I don't think it's a huge deal. And we'll see if the correction helps with that. When we pop into the center here, again, like we just saw in the untracked sample, we've got a bit of that purple fringe happening, the minor chromatic aberration, and some minor spherical distortion here. It does look like the stars are getting a little bit bloated, losing a little bit of contrast. It's not horrific or anything. Look at a brighter star here. Yeah, it's not horrific considering this lens isn't, the 40 f1.4 or anything like that. I think we're doing pretty okay. Now, if we pop into the corners, let's see these bright stars. All right, right away, we've got some business happening up here. This is astigmatism. This is not coma. Coma, or chromatic aberration, as it's known, is a type of aberration, and I really don't see any here, but it's a type of aberration where you'll get a star, or all of the stars of a certain brightness, and it will fuzz out on one end into maybe a bit of a wedge shape. And that fuzziness is meant or said to resemble a comet tail. Comet, coma, chromatic aberration, star coma, that's where that particular word comes from. You'll either have internal, where the tails will point towards the center, or external, where they point towards the edges. And while there is a bit of that spherical aberration, maybe some loss of contrast, I'm not seeing coma here. So I don't think there's really coma in this lens, but there is astigmatism. And here we have 2 types of astigmatism. You'll notice it kind of looks like a T So the stem of the T here would be tangential astigmatism, no relation to the letter T, except for starting with it. Never mind. So tangential astigmatism is found along the radii that come from the center of the frame to the edges, and it will stretch stars out along that radius because the lens is not able to focus all that light to a pinpoint. Sagittal astigmatism comes in at a right angle. Now here it is at a real right angle where it's literally crossing the T. Sometimes it might curve or appear to curve this way, but it's always going to be intersecting the tangential, even if it looks like it curves. Every star will have that same sort of reproduction pretty much. And if you look around the frame, such as here, you'll see that now it's pointed the other way, right? Because the tangential points towards the center of the frame and the sagittal effectively acts to ring the frame. And that is what's happening here. Now, why is this bad? Is it bad? Well, besides like a little bit of fringing here, the main thing that the astigmatism can do is make the stars look wonky, look weird, or look bigger than they should. So when I really notice it, and the thing I dislike most about it is when it stretches stars to such a point that it looks like you're warping through space because the edges and corners look like they have much bigger or weird shaped stars as compared to the center. Sometimes it can be used in an artistic way, and that's great. Sometimes you might not want it, especially if you're going to be stacking photos or if you're maybe doing a time lapse, which is something I do a lot. Here on the brighter stars, it's quite aggressive. This is the sagittal, this is the tangential. I know we're getting some weird little extra spikes here, but just remember it's kind of along these two axes, and these are just a function of that astigmatism. This is wide open. So I isolated this star right away because I can tell from this viewing distance that something's going on here as well, maybe. Yeah, a little bit. So, I mean, it's not her high end prime. It's not necessarily optimized for astrophotography. This is pretty much expected, and it's pretty much as expected. I don't think it's overall having a terrible effect. Small, isolated, bright stars can be corrected manually, essentially. You can come in here in Photoshop after and just fix it. So I don't think it's a huge deal breaker, at least not for someone like myself. There are other things to keep in mind, like field curvature. Field curvature is when the center of the frame is in focus, but maybe other parts of the frame are not, or vice versa. So, if you're in focus in the center, but the edges are not in focus, that's field curvature. And the way we usually diagnose this is by just how big are the stars and what do they look like in the center? And when we get out towards the edges, do the stars get big? Do they look defocused? And here, maybe a teensy tiny bit, but not by a huge amount if it's there, and it sort of would be masked by the astigmatism here in any case. So I would not say field curvature is really a going concern with this lens. Let's scroll through the aperture values real quick. So this is 2.8. So we saw with 3.2 that brighter section in the center here disappears, but so does some of our exposure. 3.5, again, now we're nice and consistently dark across the entire frame, which isn't necessarily what you want. And F4 here, this is very dark. You might try and do something like this, maybe if you're going to do a time lapse with really long exposures, maybe you want to catch star trails or something like that, and you're worried about blowing out a foreground or something. But overall, I would say 2.8 is probably not that big of a deal. Here we have F2.8. F3.2, we can see the contrast does improve maybe a tiny bit, but I don't know that it's worth shooting at 3.2. We still have that fringing. F3.5, we're not getting any kind of improvement in the center here that would make it worth doing this, and doubly so for F4. Let's look in the corner. Here we got our astigmatism, F2.8. 3.2, the astigmatism, the sagittal astigmatism tightens up a teeny bit, but doesn't go away. 3.5, it's still largely here. F4, it's still largely there. I wouldn't say there's any reason to stop down to F4. Shoot this lens wide open. Let's look in the develop module. So first thing we're going to do is find some of this fringe. We're going to remove chromatic aberrations. It never really works for the purple fringing in my experience. If you've got the magenta and green fringing on some stars, or some stars will have, depending on the lens, like a blue and a yellow or something like that, this can work with the checkbox. Usually you're going to have to come here and defringe manually, and that will take care of it. It will kill that blue color in a lot of places, but it isn't necessarily making your image monochrome, but it can get rid of some of that fringe. Now, if we come over here, enable profile corrections, this tells us a couple of things. First of all, the vignetting isn't entirely cleared up. You can see it's still in the corners a little bit, so you might have to manually adjust that some more, but it is doing a decent job. A little bit of vignetting can be nice because it draws the viewer towards the center of the frame, but that's a personal choice. The other thing that we can see here is that the lens has some pincushion distortion, very minor pincushion distortion, where as we go to the center of the frame, it appears like it's being pushed away from the viewer. So when we correct the geometry, it kind of flattens that plane out towards the viewer, stretches things in the middle a little bit. And, again, this is to taste. There's not a lot of straight lines in space other than these terrible satellite trails that are everywhere. So this isn't a game changer or a deal breaker, but it can help a little bit. And when you're using a high res camera like this, you have pixels to spare because you do lose a little bit. Let's just scale down here and you can see what's happening here. It's kind of making it look like an old CRT monitor. It's kind of fun. So you're not really losing any diagonal field of view, but you are losing a bit at the top and sides of the image. And you can watch in stars. I'll just flip it on or off and on a couple of times. You can see we're losing this star here, losing a few stars, but largely in the corners, we're maintaining that field of view. So I don't think it's a big deal, all things considered. But there we go. Sigma 45mm f2.8. That's what you can expect from astrophotography. Let's get out of Lightroom and wrap this up. Well, what'd you think? Are you willing to sacrifice a little bit of image quality for vanity? In this case, I am. So I don't know if we're in the same boat, but this lens was never going to be amazing for astrophotography. But in a pinch, it could be perfectly cromulent, especially when coupled with a lower megapixel body, such as the Nikon ZF here. I know we test with like 60 megapixels, but when you reduce the resolution, you're going to hide a lot of things like star trails, aberrations, that sort of thing. So that could be an okay thing to do. Either way, it's up to you. I'm just here to provide you the samples because I have access to the equipment, and hopefully you found those useful in some way. And yeah, I love this. I love it. It is great, but it's not going to be my first choice for astrophotography. That being said, my name's Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. I hope you have enjoyed this, and yeah, get out there and take some photos. Ow, I fell down.